Hello and welcome to my Sunday morning coffee with Dr. Childress, where I'm going to invite you today into my field battle tent, the general's tent where all the maps are laid out and everything, sort of the night before the battle or apart from the battle, where I can describe what's going on for parents and um maybe help organize your way of seeing things right now. So I tend personally, I tend to think from a military or martial mindset. I have that kind of strategic orientation to my way of thinking. One of my favorite people is Miyamoto Musashi, this samurai guy in the Book of Five Rings. I like. I've absorbed a lot of that strategy understanding. And as a young man, one of the most influential books in my life was Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, and I have that on audio books right now. And I've been known to fall asleep listening to Julius Caesar describe the events in his life. So I have kind of a military martial mind in the way I organize and conceptualize things. That's not actually a healthy thing. That's a ripple from traumas, but that's what we do. I've got an old brain. I'm rippling the traumas of the time that came before. So, this is my way of sort of seeing and approaching the situation that we're in right now. And about I don't know, a few years ago, back around probably the time I wrote Foundations, I went down to Dorsey and we filmed up a set of videos. She had a little like home studio at her place she was living at the time. So I went down and filmed up a set of videos where that was my first invitation to all of you parents into the battle tent to describe the upcoming battle that we were going into. Now, at the time, I described the battle to the parents who were at that place in time of what was coming. But now what was coming is now here. And that process of looking forward in time is called foresight and allows us to plan ahead. And that's one of the things that's greatly missing over here with a lot of people in a lot of ways, but especially in the family courts with the current crop of mental health people are here is the ability for foresight. A lot of the executive functions are gone over here. But it's not gone for me. So I can kind of say, if I drop this pen, it's going to fall. Yeah. That's not being Nostradamus. That's kind of just understanding how things work in the world. And so I can look at information sets and stuff moving through, and I say that, this is going to kind of work out in that direction, but nobody else seems to see it and they keep walking into walls. And so I filmed up a set of videos with Dorsey at that time talking about the approach and the coming battle for the parents who were there at the time to if they could use it, excellent. But at the time of battle just wasn't quite yet. Things have to do with context. If the proper context isn't there, I can do everything and all, but the context is not going to support whatever happens. Whereas once the context shows up, then it's easy. The things just happen because the context moves in and makes them happen. And that's called constructor theory. It's over in physics, but beyond our conversation now. But the context supports a lot of stuff. And so I knew at the time we didn't have the proper context, but I knew the proper context would be coming. And I was working to kind of set things up. And if anybody could use it at the time, that's great. And you parents, there's a feature about you is that you keep moving through. Um, so there's the early parents who just got divorced. There's the middle parents who are currently fighting things out, and then there's the late stage parents the children have aged out and they're now adult children. And those are not static categories. You move through those categories. However, I'm a static person in the family courts, so I see you moving through. And so I'm working at the various phases of what's going on. And what I described back then was basically a two-part strategy. And again, my martial mind, I think of it sort of like the infantry and the cavalry, kind of Napoleonic. And the infantry are the parents who are in that middle phase or early phase, even where you're encountering the mental health system directly and trying to get a proper assessment for your children and an accurate diagnosis. So you're actively engaged with the mental health people. And you're the ones who are in the position to file the licensing board complaints, and to generate the difficulty for the current crops of incompetent, ignorant, and unethical psychologists. The older stage parents, the ones who are now aged out of the situation, I see more as the cavalry, where you're not actively engaged in stuff, but you can add your voice, particularly to the APA, because that's the second focus is not only engaging the forensic psychologist directly, and their ignorance and incompetence with their reports and board complaints and everything, but really the APA, the American Psychological Association, needs to get over here and hold some conferences of experts, not forensic psychologists, but attachment experts, ethical experts, psychometric, clinical psychology, family systems. Get a bunch of people at the table and work this out. Work out the ethical issues involved, and work out basically the treatment issues. Ultimately, it's going to collaborate, or there will be a joint movement forward in developing a pilot program for the family courts that resolves everything and develops the diagnostic assessment protocol, the treatment protocol, and then the legal arguments that are underneath that. So that's coming, and that's called foresight. I can see that's coming because that's the solution to the situation. But the minds that are currently here just are not able to kind of work into that solution yet. The reason is it's a motivational issue. There's motivational barriers, and there's active people who are preventing, and that's the battle right now. We've got active battle with the people who are preventing a solution, and there are specific people. And once it's a systems, but there are people in the systems who are disabling the system's response. The system itself could respond in a healthy way, and solve the pathology in the family courts, the mental health. We absolutely have the knowledge to diagnose and treat what's going on in the family court. We're just not applying the knowledge. And so the moment we do that, everything's solved. There's just no motivation to do that from the forensic psychologists because they're ignorant like the rock, because from the Gardnerian PAS experts because they have personal motivations and in what they're doing. And so there's no motivation over here in the family courts. The APA, they're just kind of lethargic and negligently lethargic. And the AFCC is the sponsoring organization for your exploitation and low professional standards of practice. The licensing boards are nowhere to be seen because the forensic psychologists are corrupting. The influence of the forensic psychologists are corrupting the mental health response and disabling it. So there's a whole bunch of system stuff going on. And one of the things I'm going to be posting about going forward is organizational development and the steps to systems change and how you do that. Because I actually have training in that for my master's degree. So that's what I did. I spent the first 2 years from about 2008 to 2010 just studying what was going on and work. That's the organizational development part. Just gathering data, looking at the situation, reading all your research, looking at everything, figuring out what happened over here. It was clear there's the problem is competence. We don't have competent mental health people in the family courts. Well, where is that? That's the licensing boards. Why aren't the licensing boards enforcing competence? Because you're using this construct of parental alienation that doesn't exist. So there's no standards because everybody's making stuff up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define the pathology using established constructs and principles. And the moment we do that, we then activate the APA ethics code, which is what I've done, which is what I did then. So 2008 to 2010, I kind of figured out what was going on. 2010 to 2012, I developed the structure, the underlying foundations of the approach. Kind of like if you're building a building from 2010 to 2012, I was digging that big pit and putting in the pylons and everything. That was 2010 to 2012, putting in all that deep structure. Then from 2012 to 2015, I started to put in lay the foundations of concrete and start to build up. And then with foundations, my book, that's when I started to actually build the structure of the solution. It became active the moment Foundations is written. The purpose of Foundations is not yet a book. Okay, it's a tool for me, and the purpose was to activate standards 2.01 and 2.04 of the APA Ethics Code. We couldn't activate that with the Gardnerian PAS model because there's no standards for that. It doesn't exist. And so the first step to holding the mental health people accountable for competence was to define the pathology using established scientific uh, and professional knowledge of the discipline, standard 2.04. And then we could also look at their Vita and see where do they have delusional thought disorders, attachment, family systems, personality disorders, things like that. So then the moment I write this, then automatically standards 2.01 and 2.04 become active. They were active before, but now they are just clearly active because somebody's actually defined the pathology, put in the effort to do that. And so that what this does is now exposes the pathogen in the mental health system. So this is my probe into the mental health system. And then I see how they respond. And what I do, working with you or working with them or something, when you come into me for therapy, you have all sorts of defenses, personal defenses against stuff, but also social kind of presentations stuff. And so there's a cloud in front of me and you making authentic contact. And so most of the time I work with that cloud and we kind of move through that and make contact. Oh, hey, hi, how you doing? But sometimes if I want to just take a peek and see what's inside and what that basic structure is, I'll construct a probe and send it into you. And that's intersubjectivity, that's Stolero. Used to be the analyst would construct a blank screen and let you project your transference stuff onto our blank screen. But then we realized, or the psychoanalysts realized, that we couldn't be a blank screen. We were always giving you information that you were responding to. And so that's Kohut and then into Stolero and intersubjectivity. In that understanding that then though, we can still understand what our information set. So then we can kind of extract our information set that we've given you from the overall situation. It's kind of like the Webb telescope, and you get this little faint signal, but we can take out all the noise from the data. And so by the analyst, or what I do, constructing the probe in, I know what that information is that I'm sending into you, and it should hit on your structures, boom, and it's going to bounce back. And it's going to bounce back through all the shading of your defensive process. And so when that echo comes back to me like sonar, I just have to take out the information set. It should have hit on certain networks and I should be getting that. And then I get to see the underlying structures. So the same thing with this, I'm sending a probe into professional psychology. This is absolutely true and correct. It's 100% true and correct. There's no way I can do what I did in this book, integrate all that information if it wasn't accurate. More recently, I made some predictions, the 3 diagnostic indicated, 12 associate clinical signs. When you start collecting those, you'll find those are present. So that's the scientific method. I made predictions. You're going to find those are present. And indeed, Greenham, Childress, and Pruder, up on ResearchGate, has found exactly that with the 12 associate clinical signs, that they are present. And the only way you can get those symptoms and that prediction is if everything about this is correct. So now, if the people in the mental health field reject this, then they're not serious about the pathology. They're not serious about solving it. And this puts everybody on standard 1.0 or 2.01 and 2.04 of the APA ethics code. And so we'll talk. Let's start by talking about what that does to the Gardnerian PAS experts, because that was the first group of your mental health people I encountered over here, because they're supposedly your allies. Now I know they are the problem, because they are fostering this non-existent pathology that is degrading the quality of mental health services in the family courts. I looked at who they were, and Bill Burnett, he's a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, retired psychiatrist, and he's been working in the family courts the entire time, uh, and was a big expert in PAS, and has this parental alienation study group he was forming in 2012, and I joined that for a little bit, and there was a little few conversations early on, emails with Bill Burnett. Interestingly, there's a tell regarding the narcissistic pathology that it calls me Craig right off the bat. And no, I'm Dr. Childress. And I don't mind if you call me Craig. I don't mind if you call me anything. That's not the important thing. But it's a narcissistic response of trying to take me down a peg and make us on equal levels. And we're all kind of buddy buddy kind of stuff. And so Bill was sending out a communication that we're all together and buddy, and trying to co-opt me and seduce me into the PAS people. And I said, no, we got to kill PAS. And I made that really clear to him from the start, that parental alienation syndrome as a construct needs to die, because we need to apply established knowledge. And you can see why now when you see the ethical series that I just produced over on the Fireside Chat series, that all of those ethical standards violations, 2.01, 2.04, 9.01, and all the others, come from the ability of defining this within established knowledge. And we don't get any of those with PAS. We stay in a world of constant conflict, fighting about whether or not there's this new form of pathology, when it is 100% unnecessary. If we simply define the pathology within established knowledge, then we have the diagnosis immediately, and we can know how to do it, and we know how to treat it, and diagnosis becomes child psychological abuse. Now, back at the time, 2012, when I'm making contact with Bill Burnett, that was pre DSM 5. So Bill was all wrapped up with his people trying to get the DSM 5 people, American Psychiatric Association, to accept the construct of parental alienation. Now, it was already in the DSM 4 as a shared delusional disorder. That's shared psychotic disorder. And so it was a diagnosable thing in the DSM 5. And that's a psychiatric book. And Bill Burnett is a psychiatrist. So he actually misdiagnosed the pathology for his entire career. He had a psychosis, a psychotic pathology sitting in his office, but he was so focused on his parental alienation stuff of Gardner that he just didn't consider, he didn't apply the actual knowledge, in which case it was a shared psychotic disorder, a shared persecutory delusion. So he just missed the diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder. And you can look back at my early writings on that. I said, yeah, foundations is that, it's a shared psychotic disorder. And that, I suspect, embarrasses Bill Burnett. If he admits I'm right, then all of parental alienation syndrome in Gardner disappears, and that's what his entire career is based on, is PAS. And then he acknowledges that I came in and I diagnosed a psychiatric pathology. I'm a psychologist. I diagnosed a psychiatric pathology when he just missed it. That's awful embarrassing for a psychiatrist. So Bill wanted to co-opt me into the Gardner PAS thing. I've been describing over and over to Bill. You can see it on my blogs. I met with him personally, described things, how that provides no solution. PAS provides zero solution. They've had it for 40 years, zero solution. There's an argument among sports guys. I'm a sports guy in an old guy body. And everybody argues about it. Oh, it shoulda, woulda, if only that, call had gone our way, or if he hadn't dropped the pass, or whatever it is. There's always woulda, coulda, shoulda arguments among sports guys. But the shutdown for that, when you get tired of that, you just tell your buddy, scoreboard, which means look at the scoreboard. Who won, who lost? You got all your arguments. Who won, who lost? Scoreboard. And I called scoreboard on the Gardnerian PAS for people around 2017. I said, holy cow, you have solved absolutely nothing. Everything's in conflict. Scoreboard, give somebody else a chance to solve things. Give established knowledge, your ethical obligations, a chance to solve this. Apply the established knowledge as you should be doing before you start making up your new theories, and actually make the diagnosis. But interestingly, Bill Burnett and all the PAS people, I heard through the grapevine that they had a phone call conversation of how do we stop Dr. Childress because he's going to destroy PAS. And so they came up with this strategy to not discuss me at all, just nothing. They're going to show me if I don't participate with them in PAS, they're going to blacklist me from professional discussion, and they're the powerful people. Now that's severely questionable moral character, to withhold a solution to the pathology so that you can continue to be an expert when you know the solution is right there. And in 2013, when the DSM-5 came out, they just nothing on PAS. But there were a couple of interesting changes I can talk about later, but nothing on PAS. So they said no, there's no such thing as PAS. Now, any normal professional moves on then from PAS. The American Psychiatric Association said no. That's 2013. But Bill didn't move on, and Gottlieb and Woodall and Lorandos and the whole group, Baker, more recently Harmon has joined, Jennifer Harmon joined the group, the Gardnerian PAS experts. Now I will note, you can look at their stuff and you can look at their articles that they wrote, Harmon and Burnett and everybody. None of them are talking about a shared delusional disorder. None of them are talking about cross-generational coalitions, emotional cutoffs. None of them are talking about factitious attachment pathology or attachment pathology. They're all still focused on this parental alienation thing. All of them are in violation of 2.04, but that also indicates a professional lack of professional quality. When I have solved it and none of them are even discussing it, that's my probe in. My probe in was this, and we see it bounce off of who they are and reveal who they are. So that's what I did. First off, is this revealed who they were, and I was trying to work with Bill early on, but he was just not going to let go of PAS. Ultimately, it wound up in a meeting with Dorsey and Bill and a parent advocate and our wives over in Venice. And I began documenting Bill into the situation where I'm proposing collaborations with him on writing articles to resolve this. I'm writing articles on the transition from parental alienation to established knowledge and writing articles about the diagnosis in the DSM-5, co-authoring them. But he said no. He said, nope, the only solution he would accept was one that involved Gardner's PAS. And no, Gardner's PAS needs to die so that we can hold the mental health professionals accountable to 2.01, 2.04, 9.01, so we can elevate the standards of practice in the family courts and get a solution to this. But Bill would not relent. So for the last 5, 6, 7 years, he's been continuing his parental alienation push. In 2020, he wrote an article about 5 parts to parental alienation syndrome. And he says in the opening paragraph, I'm talking about parental alienation syndrome from the 1980s. So that's a fixed and false belief maintained despite contrary evidence. The contrary evidence is the American Psychiatric Association looked at the proposal and they said, no, it's an awful diagnostic model. And it is. Oh my God. It's, even if there was the pathology, it's an awful diagnostic model. And they said, no, completely flat out. But Bill Burnett thinks he knows more than the American Psychiatric Association. So he's going to convince the American Psychiatric Association that he's right and they're wrong. It strikes me as a little grandiose. And um, and so that was my first encounter with your mental health people, trying to get the folks who were supposedly your allies over here to join with a solution to this situation. But instead, they purposely worked against the established knowledge. They're continuing to do that. They worked against informing people, informing parents that a solution was available. Beginning in 2013, we lost the diagnosis of the shared psychotic disorder because Bill was off with his parental alienation games. But we got the diagnosis of child psychological abuse. And I said, that's wonderful. Shared persecutory delusion is child psychological abuse. So you can see in my blogs and stuff, I began to run with the child psychological abuse diagnosis, still am. This is we need a risk assessment for possible child abuse. That's the diagnosis here, one way or the other. But you can see in the PAS people, Bill Burnett, Amy Baker, Jennifer Harmon, Linda Gottlieb, just Lorandos, whoever that group is, Parental Alienation Study Group, that none of them have shifted over to uh, child psychological abuse diagnosis because PAS can't get you there. If you say, oh, it's PAS, therefore child psychological abuse, the other side comes in and says there's no such thing as PAS. And then you're fighting about whether or not there's this new form of pathology and there's no whether, and that's the purpose of it. The pathogen the that's in our brains or the pathology motivates people to do things. It's a trauma pathology, and it seeks allies, and it gets allies on their narcissism, and it got allies in the Gardner PAS people on their narcissism that they're creating some or discovering some new sort of new pathology, and they're experts in something. They're not experts in anything. They're not experts in attachment or family systems or delusional thought disorders, or they're not experts in anything. ADHD, autism, nothing except the made up pathology of parental alienation. So as long as they're allowed to just make stuff up, then they're an expert. And then they market themselves to the unwary public as being experts in something that they're just made up. So they wouldn't move over. But I always knew that they were not actually the problem. They were just supposedly your allies. So what this did was reveal your false allies. But what this is designed to do is reveal the forensic psychologists and hold them accountable for their ethical standards. Bill Burnett's a psychiatrist. Gottlieb's a social worker. Amy Baker's a researcher. She's not licensed, and so none of these people are actual psychologists, clinical psychologists working with the pathology. They each come from different backgrounds. Woodall's a master's level person. Lorandos is the only one that's a psychologist, and so he'd be applicable under 2.01 and 2.04. I've read one of his reports, and yeah, there's problems with his attachment and delusional thought disorders. Uh, I saw him using a little bit of family system stuff in one of his analyses. But he's vulnerable because it's the APA ethics code. Bill Burnett's a retired psychiatrist, so there's no ethical stuff that he's required to do, obviously. And Amy Baker's not licensed. She's a researcher. There's no ethical stuff that would have to come through the American Psychological Association Ethics Committee for practice beyond the boundaries of her competence and for standard 2.04, the application of knowledge to her professional judgments. And they're all vulnerable to that on parental alienation. It's not a non-existent thing. It's substantially beneath professional standards of practice to use parental alienation. It's in violation of 2.04, and it degrades the quality of mental health services in the family courts. We need to establish knowledge and baseline of knowledge, and hold people accountable to that. And parental alienation allows people to just degrade the quality of services in the family courts. So, so I knew the forensic psychologists, though they're the ones who control the situation. They control the AFCC. They've infiltrated the APA. You don't see Bill Burnett in the APA. Robin Deutsch you see in the APA. And Bill Burnett's writing little journal articles. You got Stahl and Simon who are defining an entire field of forensic psychology. So we have specific people in forensic psychology, but they're also spread out. There are a whole bunch of individual people everywhere. So there's no real substance that anybody can identify. They work beneath the cover that no one sees. Whereas your allies are out there, marching and holding, various protests and things and memes and writing and advocating that we get parental alienation proven to somebody. And that was another element of my initial analysis, is that you parents have a problematic mindset. At least the parents I came in with at the time, in that you had two problems with your mindset. One is that you had a victim mindset, and you are a victim, and so there's a lot of stuff that plays into that. But the pathogen had triggered your insecurity to where you felt the need, or they felt the need to prove something to somebody. And oh my gosh, that has just been such a hard thing to get you people to stop doing. You need to prove something. Prove you're a good parent. Prove you're a good parent. And so you get volumes of data that you got to prove reality, and you're trying to prove you're a good parent to a judge, and that the other parent's a bad parent to a judge. That's exactly what the pathology wants you to do. It wants to drive this into the court to make you prove to somebody you deserve to have a child. That's insane. This is not a legal issue. This is not a custody issue. The custody issue is a symptom of the pathology. That one pathological parent drives it into the court. This isn't a court issue. Court's already decided on custody. Pretty simple. Variant of 50-50, variant of every other weekend, or distance if they're separated by like bi-coastal family or something, holidays to one, school year to the other. The courts can make those decisions relatively simple. It's the child's pathology, the child's attachment pathology and rejection of a parent that complicates the situation. And that's a treatment issue. So what's it doing in the family courts? Why are people trying to teach a judge or convince a judge about a pathology and get a judge to diagnose this made up parental alienation thing? Because the forensic psychologists have failed. They're not diagnosing the pathology. They're not conducting a proper risk assessment. They're not applying the established knowledge of psychology. And so they're in violation routinely of 2.01, 2.04, and 9.01 of the AP Ethics Code. And they don't care. And their whole model for custody evaluations is extraordinarily problematic, in violation of principle D justice and a number of other things, principles of psychometrics, all sorts of stuff. So then you look back and say, who gave these people permission to do that? Who gave Robin Deutsch permission to come up with her belief, her approach, or Stahl or Simon? They describe it in chapter 2 of their book. Of forensic psychology is different than clinical psychology. Who gave them permission to go away from clinical psychology and being doctors and become agents of the state? It was an experiment on you. Forensic psychology is an experiment. It's an experimental service delivery. And oh my God, has it failed miserably. When doctors stop being doctors, bad things happen, which is exactly what happened. Back in the 1980s, everybody was fighting. The clinical psychologists come in here and say, oh my goodness, we have narcissistic and borderline personality. And the courts say, we don't want to talk about the pathology of the parent. We want to know what to do about the situation. We don't want to get in a battle of labels being tossed back and forth. So then somebody thought it was a good idea to develop a specialty practice that provides the judges with the answer the judges want, which is not about pathology, which is about what the custody schedule should be. And so we don't diagnose pathology, and in their own aspirational guidelines, aspirational guidelines, in their own aspirational guidelines, They say, well, we don't like diagnostic labels. And so see if you can avoid those, be really reluctant to use. Well, diagnostic labels are like, shared persecutory delusion and child psychological abuse. So if you're not telling the judge that there's a shared persecutory delusion and child psychological abuse, you're withholding information from the court. And they say it's because it's more prejudicial than probative. It's only prejudicial to the pathological parent. It's probative to the targeted parent. The targeted parent wants the judge to know that the allied parent is significantly pathological and it is psychologically abusing the child. That's probative for the, it means it has value for the targeted parent. It's prejudicial to the pathological parent in getting full custody of the child because everybody says, oh my goodness, they're a child abuser. So the forensic psychologists are putting their finger on the scale of what the court knows, withholding relevant information from the court, not disclosing from the court. And there's just a lot of bad things in forensic psychology. But now we're turning back to like 2010, 2012. I know this, but I'm going to go up. We have to get rid of forensic psychology and get clinical psychologists to return. They won't return. It's too dangerous. It's partly too dangerous because any clinical psychologist who comes over here is going to get sanctioned by the licensing boards, by the forensic psychologists on the licensing board, because they're not doing a forensic custody evaluation. As long as you do a forensic custody evaluation, you can do whatever you want. But the moment you don't do that, you're vulnerable to being sanctioned from the licensing board. And that's the forensic psychologist. So clinical psychologists know this is narcissistic and borderline, highly vengeful and retaliating. The court slows everything down, so treatment's not going to be effective. So it's just putting your license on the line for nothing, for no reason, working with the hardest pathology possible. Narcissistic and borderline personality pathology, that's nasty pathology to work with. Very vengeful, very retaliatory. It's the abuse pathology. You come over here, you got my opposing counsel trying to get you, you got flying monkeys trying to get you, the pathology is trying to attack you if you try to change it. So clinical psychologists won't work over here. I know that because I didn't work here my entire career. Look at my vita. I worked everywhere else but here. ADHD, autism, trauma, pediatric psychology. There's everywhere. I've worked everything except family courts until I started moving into retirement and said, what's going on over here? And took a peek. Oh my goodness, this is my pathology. It's active child abuse and active spousal abuse. No one's doing anything about it. I have duty to protect obligations. And there's a lot of unethical practice in my psychologists. And so I have 1.04 and 1.05 active since the beginning, since I first fell down the rabbit hole and recognized what's happening here. I've had 1.04 and 1.05 ethical obligations and duty to protect obligations. And that's why I went up immediately with the Pasadena YouTubes, is to give you as much information as I possibly could, as early as I could, in case you could use it. This is active child abuse. This is active spousal abuse. But it's going to take me some time to change it because I'm just a single lone psychologist working in private practice. And I'm going to go up against the entire power of the AFCC and the people embedded in the committees of the APA and all the appearance of the forensic psychologists and their power. They're on the licensing boards and all this stuff. And I'm just one psychologist going up against all. That's my David and Goliath. But I have a rock of the APA ethics code. 2.01 says what it says. 2.04 says what it says. 9.01 says what it says. And that's like my rock. Interesting. I read an article once about David and Goliath being the difference between ranged attack and melee attack. If you know anything about gaming or something, melee, you get in there and you're taking hits, but ranged attack, you just, whoo, pew. And I can do that all day, tossing rocks into the forensic psychologist. I just need to be safe from their retaliation. But I also wanted to, or put myself out there as in a vulnerable position because I know the pathogen attacks. I know the forensic psychologists are going to attack the application of knowledge. And so that's why I have to stand here. And so once I'm standing on the solid foundations of knowledge, Then when the licensing board attacks me, I go, what are you attacking me for? For applying knowledge and telling people that they have ethical standards, and you're going to come after me instead of the forensic psychologist? That will expose them. However, it's vital that when they do attack, when the forensic psychologists somewhere attack me for something, a blog post, a report, something, anything, that they don't find anything, because if they find anything, that's going to cloud the issue. Finally, Oregon, the forensic psychologist in Oregon got provoked because the licensing board complaint generated from one of my reports, my custody resolution method report, you can look it up on my blog, um, produced a board complaint against the forensic psychologist for failure to duty protect. And the Oregon board sanctioned me, kind of expanding their jurisdiction for practice in Oregon without a license. It's jurisdictional, it's not ethical. But they want me gone from Oregon. Why? What is the information that's so dangerous to the public in what I'm saying? Well, it's not dangerous to the public, it's dangerous to the incompetent, ignorant forensic psychologists. And so that's why they don't want me in Oregon, because then the forensic psychologists are going to be in trouble. And we can go more specifically into that. So that's the issue right now, is the encounter with the forensic psychologist. And this has been building for a number of years. The foundations has a number of reasons for its title. And I'll let you guys, after I'm gone, try to figure out all the different variants of that. It lays the foundations for the ethical complaints. It lays the foundations for the application of established knowledge. But also there's Isaac Asimov's trilogy, Foundations, where there's a psychohistorian can kind of use mathematics and probability theories and predict how people are going to respond in the general flow of events. And so he does stuff that called Selden crises, that no matter that things are going to narrow down until there's a decision point. And people can have kind of off ramps, but if it doesn't, it's going to get down to this crisis point where it doesn't really matter who's making the decision. The context is going to force a certain decision upon that person. And that's what we're reaching, kind of. The ethical violations in forensic psychology is going to collapse them. We have the fact that this is moving through the overall mindset is we have the Blue Ribbon Commission on forensic custody evaluations that pretty much takes them out. They looked at it. I wasn't involved, and they took a look at it, and yeah, they call them dangerous to children, no scientific value, and harmful to children. And the practice should be stopped, and there's no way to fix it. That's the findings of the Blue Ribbon Commission on forensic custody evaluations. I agree with them 100%. There's a number of legal stuff moving through now. Cadence law, which is developed mostly the movement on that, the motivation of that is through the people I call domestic violence monkeys, DV monkeys. And they put out domestic violence as the lead issue. And that's why we need to protect the child somehow because there used to be domestic violence. And they pretty much accept all allegations of domestic violence as accurate. And what we need to do is just shift it over to intimate partner violence, do an actual assessment of that. But it's a secondary issue. The issue is child abuse. Once we get the divorce, does that parent present a risk of child abuse to that child? And you say, well, there was exposure and past trauma and stuff. That's very interesting. And we'll look at that. I'm out of foster care. I'm out of that world. We'll look at IPV spousal abuse. Was it situational or was it terrorist? If it's terrorist IPV, then yeah, we need to kind of attend to that situation. If it's situational IPV, intimate partner violence, then once we get the divorce, that's not an issue. So yeah, if that's a race, that's an issue. But on the flip side, is it a shared persecutory delusion coming out of a borderline personality pathology? So we gotta get our diagnosis has to be accurate 100% of the time. So if we just go with this DV monkey kind of stuff of, oh, all domestic violence is a problem, then we're going to misdiagnose child psychological abuse by a borderline personality. So my counter argument to the DV people on Caden's law is what in your statutes diagnoses or identifies the child psychological abuse by a borderline spectrum mom, or child psychological abuse by a narcissistic spectrum dad using the child as a weapon against the normal range mom, the spousal psychological abuse of the mother, and you're not dealing with that at all. And so there's two litigants and there's two sides to this. There's two differential diagnoses. Both need to be addressed equally well because we need an accurate diagnosis 100% of the time. And because the court needs to rely on our diagnosis. If we're returning a diagnosis of child abuse, the court needs to rely on that. It cannot rely on forensic custody evaluations because they just make stuff up in their personal opinions, which is kind of my consulting practice right now, is kind of applying the established knowledge to the information reported by the custody reporters to correct their situation, because they've already done this massive data collection evaluation that has been extraordinarily problematic. And so but ultimately we need to shift over to getting active, accurate assessments, but we're not even anywhere close to that. What's going to happen is potentially that some forensic psychologists may shift to a clinical approach. So I'm going to be in direct opposition to Simon and Stahl, Robert Simon and Philip Stahl, in their book on how to do custody evaluations, chapter 2. I'm going to be in direct opposition to them. In chapter 2, 2013 was written by Stahl and Simon, 2020 second edition, Simon and Stahl. So they're both saying exactly the same thing in chapter 2 in exactly the same words almost. That they recommend a forensic mindset, not a clinical mindset. They say the clinical mindset is wrong and in error, and that their forensic mindset is accurate and correct. I would argue the forensic mindset has solved nothing in 40 years. I'm going to call scoreboard on them. What have you solved in your 40 years? We're still in our adolescence. Well, then you're done, because you've had 40 years to solve this and you haven't. And we need to get this solved within 2 years. And so you really messed up. This has been a failed experiment in service delivery. We've learned a lot. So let's apply what we've learned and revisit the issue of how we're doing to deal with this pathology in the family courts. We know it's narcissistic, borderline, dark personality pathology, dark personality, dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, dark tetrad. We know they're in the family courts, highly manipulative, of the courts. So we know that's there. Okay, you're concerned a child rejects a parent. Maybe that's an abusive parent. Well, let's get on that and diagnose that if that's present. We always protect the child. However, we also need to address this narcissistic borderline and take it up straight up. And it shouldn't be any old psychologist running in here, not the individual therapist who we need to assess for a possible shared persecutory delusion. That's a specialized domain of practice. Right now, no one knows how to do that because the only people are in schizophrenia. However, within 5 years, get some trainings in here, and you can get targeted training on mental status examathon perception, and everybody knows what to look for, and we can elevate the professional standards of practice in the family courts. But we have to get discussing the issue. We have to get talking about it, which exposes the Gardner PAS people for their degradation of the issues. Now, ultimately, I'm saying put me on a debate. If Bill Burnett wants to argue about whether PAS exists, I'll say no. He says yes. Let's put us on an online debate for 2 hours. Let's end the fighting. The professionals need to end the fighting. I'm alleging that Bill Burnett is degrading the quality of professional services in the family courts, that he's spreading medical psychiatric misinformation by promoting parental alienation syndrome rather than not discussing shared delusional disorders and child psychological abuse. 2020 paper by Bill and Lorandos. Where in that did they discuss the possibility of a shared persecutory delusion? Where did they discuss the attachment pathology involved? Where did they discuss the possibility of a child psychological abuse? Nowhere. I'd say that's a failure in their duty to protect. I'd say that's a spreading medical psychiatric misinformation. The American Psychiatric Association said there's no such thing. So, but put us on a debate. Bill wants to defend his position. Let's defend it. Okay. But if you're just going to remain silent and continue to degrade the quality and mislead parents off of a road that puts them in the family courts, having to prove pathology to a judge rather than over to a psychologist to get an accurate diagnosis of child abuse, that's a problem. Ethically for Bill, that's a problem. Morally for Bill, um, and you kind of look at his motivations. The moment we switch to established knowledge, he becomes irrelevant. And we're done with PAS, and that's his entire career. And so he's willing to obstruct, not tell anybody, not tell parents, not tell other professionals, not engage. And he's had opportunities to publish papers. He could have published, some support for my work or directed people over to what I'm saying. He didn't. He chose not to. So he's withholding information from the general public that would serve them to stop the pathology. Once we're past this and into the solution, and people have shifted over in the paradigm shift, that exposes the moral issues involved with Bill. And that's what I'm doing over here. I'm providing a stimulus that is going in and bouncing off the system and producing the systems, exposing the system. So they can respond differently. The petition to the APA is one of these things. I carefully constructed what I'm putting into them. That these are the ethical violations. Uh, Parts 1 and 2, we're just supporting that. Part 3 is the ethical violations. Part 4 is the remedy. I constructed this nice little information set and hand delivered it right into the APA. Now that moves through and it's going to bounce off the APA and reveal its structure. What is their structure? Complete apathy. Why? Because they gave it over, likely, to a committee of forensic psychologists and they killed it. And so the forensic psychologists, whoever they gave it to, are the ones personally, those are the ones that are disabling the APA's response to the pathology in the family courts. So, want to know who they give the ethics, the petition to the APA to? That will expose them. That's what I'm doing. And so, but my final piece was getting the attack of the forensic psychologists on the licensing board, because that's the insidious one. That's the one that's corrupting everything. And that's not necessarily these top people. That's just whoever's all the forensic psychologists everywhere. If they're sitting on the licensing boards, they are exempting the forensic psychologists from 2.01, 2.04, 9.01 because they're doing the same thing. And so it's self-review. And that's how we got so bad over here, is who's responsible for, the maintaining ethical standards of practice. That would be the licensing boards. So that's their failure. And so everything's going to be getting exposed right now. The problem is for you parents, and I'll start wrapping up here. The problem for you parents is that the forensic psychologists are going to be discredited and totally out of the family courts. Clinical psychologists are not here. And you've got the DV monkeys saying, we don't want these 4-day workshops. And now the 4-day workshops are an interesting thing, and we can talk about those later. Primarily, there are 4 of them. There's Family Bridges and High Road that came off of the collaboration of, from what my understanding of, Dr. Randy Rand and Dorsey Pruder collaborated. Dr. Rand took his work to Richard Rorschach and they developed Family Bridges. Dorsey Pruder took her part of the collaboration, developed the High Road. So those are one set of these 4-day workshops. Those are the first ones that they're based on a psychoeducational approach, a different model for how to intervene than we classically use in psychotherapy. There's no psychotherapy 4-day models for anything, not for substance abuse or depression or anxiety or ADHD or autism, nothing. There's no 4-day intensive treatment for anything in professional psychology because that's not what we do. That wouldn't be appropriate for any model of psychotherapy. But they're not using psychotherapy. They're doing something different. And so it's like really interesting. It's a different approach. I call it elegant. I think it's useful. Obviously, Dorsey's got 10 years over here fixing the worst of the pathology. She's working with narcissistic borderline pathology actively in the family courts that no foreign clinical psychologist, no clinical psychologist will work with because it's such a hard pathology. Dorsey Pruder's over here. She's a family coach and businesswoman. She's over here for 10 years solving it. So the psychologist should go talk to her. But so those are two. Then Sullivan and Deutsch developed one from the forensic psychology called Overcoming Barriers. So that's not going to work. I've read kind of their material, and I said, that's not going to work. And it didn't work. And now it's shut down, and they're saying, oh, we've revamped it and stuff. No, it failed. And so I wonder about all these families that gave them the money, went to this 4-day thing that did no good whatsoever. And so again, these forensic psychologists just believe they're allowed to experiment on these families. Well, let's try this, and let's try that, and see what I. No, apply knowledge. You got to go back to clinical psychology. Going back to the debate issue, all debate, Bill Burnett, but really, the debate is between Robin Deutsch and Dr. Childress, or Stahl and Simon and Dr. Childress. Get your top forensic psychologist and your clinical psychologist, and let's debate the issue. Is what the role of forensic versus clinical psychology in the family courts. They think they're doing a good job. They support your position. You've had 40 years. You got a big vita. You think forensic psychology is doing the job, and we need to stay doing what you do. Then put up and shut up. Let's have an online debate. Robert Simon or Philip Stahl. Let's put us up. Law school. The role of forensic versus clinical psychologists. I'm saying there's a number of ethical violations of forensic psychology. Defend yourself. Defend the practice of forensic psychology. You've got 2 books defending it. You've got chapter 2 is banging on clinical psychologists as being the wrong mindset. So come defend your forensic psychologist, because I disagree. I think the forensic psychologist mindset, forensic mental FMHP, mental health professional construct mindset is unethical and degrades the quality of services, and it needs to end because it's just awful. So, but they were the ones that support it. So and up to 2020, that's their most recent book. So let's put us on an online debate. That's where we're headed. It's my license. They've taken a shot at my license, but now it's a continual vulnerability of their license in every testimony, in every report they write, until they become ethical. They're going to be vulnerable, especially as I go forward teaching attorneys how to cross-examine mental health professionals. It's going to raise an interesting issue in the AFCC when the attorneys, the family law attorneys, will be learning how to go after the license of the psychologist sitting in the chair next to them at their national convention. That'll be an interesting situation for the AFCC to deal with. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm sending in the probes, and it's bouncing off their structure to reveal who they are. So I've revealed the AFCC. I've revealed in the 2017, I went and talked to a national convention so they can say, oh, you never told us. Yes, I did. Well, we don't listen to ourselves. Well, that's your problem. And what were their response when I told them? They removed the CE units from everybody because of Gene Mercer. So I've exposed Gene Mercer coming through. And so there's just a number of things that's the current situation. So we're on a linear path. We're done over and over. What's going to be happening is forensic psychology is going to collapse, and Gardnerian people are going to collapse. There's going to be the DV monkeys driving their laws through, trying to prevent Dorsey from solving things, and that's who they're targeting on this, is Dorsey. Richard Rorschach's already had to surrender his license, so they've already beat him up pretty bad through number of stuff. That's why I don't say much about Richard Rorschach. He's already been beaten up pretty bad by the pathogen. But and Dorsey has too, but she's survived. And so really, these cadence law things, or the legislation, if you're going to start banging on 4-day workshops, get Dorsey to testify and get the honest information about what they are. You can ask Deutsch to come testify about overcoming barriers if you want. Gottlieb, get talk, Gottlieb to talk. Oh, then Gottlieb came up with her fourth one. So we have Dorsey and family bridges. We have overcoming barriers. That's a failure. And then Gottlieb, kind of in the spasm of her late career, decides she's going to solve it with this parental alienation thing, that the 4-day workshop that she's developed. And oh my goodness, do I have ethical concerns about that, and just practice concerns. And I'll be talking about all this stuff going forward in the future because we're on the battlefield. My next approach will be to develop a Vita series, and I'll just go through the Vitas one by one. I have to stay safe because, oh my goodness, there's been all sorts of stuff going on, so I have to be very careful in what I say. But looking at Vitas is, let's look at who's here. I'll put my Vita up because that's what it is right now. Credibility with the court. Is Dr. Childress credible with the court? That's what the court wants to know. So let's start looking at Vitas and seeing who's credible and who's not over here. And we'll solve this. That's going to put all you parents in a difficult position because there's going to be no mental health services in the family courts. I don't know what you're going to do about that. I can consult with dialectic behavior therapists, but I would recommend the dialectic behavior therapist. No clinical psychologist should work here because it's too dangerous. So if they're willing to put their license on the line to come over here, okay, I can consult with them, but their license will be on the line until the APA takes charge of the situation, or until the state legislatures develop a pilot program for the family courts. Give it to your top university as your principal investigator. I would recommend get some consultation with me because I've worked major NIMH research projects. I'm an old guy. I've done a lot of this stuff, and I've solved the pathology. So let's get a pilot program in. Take about 2 years, 6 months to set it up, 6 months for data analysis and report writing, a year to run a pilot program with family courts, develop the diagnostic assessment protocol, develop the treatment protocol, and the legal arguments to support it underneath that. In the meantime, let's get some debates up. Let's online debates. Let's put the issue out there because this is happening in Spain and the Netherlands, the Balkans, just Germany, England, everywhere. I'm wondering about Japan. I'm not hearing stuff out of Japan. But this needs a united solution. The mental health people need to stop arguing about what's going on. We need to apply established knowledge. The moment we do that, we fix it. Return to clinical psychologists. This is about diagnosis and pathology. This is not about custody. So with that, I'm going to wrap up kind of my discussion in the officer's tent about where we are and where we're headed. It's going to be brutal over the next period of time. This is a motivational pathology. No one's been motivated to solve this. It's going to have to get better before it gets worse, before there's enough pain in the system to get the higher elements of the system to turn down and says, why is this causing us so much pain? And so as soon as we get that self-reflective insight, it's Friston, as soon as we free the energy to look at this, then we'll have a solution. Right now, we're kind of running on automatic pilot. The professional psychologists are. Big issue. I recommend the APA issue a press release that supports standard 2.01 of the APA ethics code. That's all they have to do. Just issue a press release saying that they support standard 2.01. That's really important. Then to designate these families as a special population deserving special protections because of their compromised autonomy and decision making because of court involvement. So they're, I think, represent a special population requiring special protections against exploitation. And then the third is to develop a conference of experts on attachment, ethics, psychometrics, family systems, cultural psychology, no forensic psychology. But you develop your conference of experts to identify what the pathology is in the family courts, issue a paper on that, differential diagnosis and everything, and then develop a second conference of experts about what to do about the pathology in the family courts. How do we solve the pathology in the family courts? And so the APA can do that, and legislatures can do that through a pilot program. Until we reach that point, things are going to be brutal. So good luck, everybody out there. I'm here to serve as consultation. I'm not putting my license on the line anymore. I took my one hit, and that's all I should be asked to do at this point. Until we make it safe to be over here, no clinical psychologist should work in the family courts, because there's no reason we have to put our license on the line to work here. You guys need to figure it out over here, and I can help you figure it out as soon as there's motivation within the court system to figure it out, or as soon as there's motivation within the psychology system to figure it out. Right now, there's no motivation. There's an infection by the pathology in mental health profession and the pathogen, and we need to cleanse the infection of the pathogen. So let me tell you one. Let me know one other story. I'm going to run a little long today. Let me tell you one other little story. When I was a kid, my mom always had us out weeding the yard like every week. Oh my God, we hated to do that on me and my brothers, and on a Saturday or Sunday, spending several hours of our Saturday morning weeding various areas of the yard. But there's certain types of weeds, and she taught us about the different types of weeds as we were out there doing that. And so the first one is oxalis, and that's a kind of a spread ground cover thing. But the danger with that is it had little seeds everywhere, but it only has one root going in. And so what you go do with an oxalis is you slide your hand under the mat to get that one. You dig around the ground, you loosen up the ground, and then you slide your hand under the mat, locate that root, and then you can lift it out and put it in your weed bucket without spreading the seeds. So it's kind of delicate, but it's easy to get out. It releases pretty easy. The other is chickweed, and that's like the little grassy stuff, and you just pull that out. Easy peasy. That's not a problem. The two that are more difficult are the crabgrass and the devilgrass, because if you leave any of the roots in there, they grow back. The crabgrass is a little bit easier to get out. Devil's grass is really nasty. If you leave any of the root or any of the stem leaves, even, they will grow roots again. So you have to really get that out and really be careful that you get all of it out. So that involves like loosening up all the ground around it. And then you have to go in very gently and carefully and go deep into the soil and make sure you feel around for where those roots are, and then take the thing out, roots and all. Because otherwise you're coming back and looking at more infection of devil's grass the following week. So you want to get that. That's what we need in the forensic psychology in the family courts with the infection of the pathogen. We need to go in and get it out at the roots. And it's infecting the APA, it's affecting the licensing boards, it's infecting just general professional practice in the family courts. So we got to get in there and pull it out by the roots, and to get a healthy mental health response again. Diagnosis and treatment. We know what the pathology is. We can do that. But we need to stop fighting around the children. So with that, let me say goodbye for today, and then we'll talk to you next week. Take care, everybody.